Well, hello, everybody, and thanks very much for joining us for another one of our TESS seminars. TESS, of course, is our Center for Tropical Environmental and Sustainability Science here at JCU. This is our last semester of the year of 2025, so it's wonderful that we've got such an eminent speaker here today. And for me, I must say, this is my last seminar as a director of TESS. I've been doing it for 16 years, and we've had more than 400 seminars in that time, and lots of other things that we've done, and we're kind of proud of that. But anyway, TESS will be moving on, and Susan Lawrence, Professor Susan Lawrence, will be taking over as the director next year. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to introduce John Endler. John and I have a few things in common. John's a Canadian national. He grew up in the Montreal area. Are you Francophone? Speak French?
No.
Okay.
The story is Romeo and Juliet, father French, mother English, and their family refused to talk to us.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm not going to get into family dynamics.
No.
On that basis. So John did his PhD at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, which is actually
Edinburgh.
Edinburgh. So I thought you said Berkeley.
Undergraduate.
Undergraduate at Berkeley.
Yeah,
oh,
sorry.
I'm talking about PhD. Anyway, okay, Edinburgh, fantastic university in the UK. He was an eminent faculty member at the University of California at Santa Barbara for quite a while, and then he was recruited by JCU to come out here. And this is quite a few years ago, to come out here and be the chairman or the head of the school or department that was here at the time. I think it was zoology. Is that right? The zoology department. John has worked on many different things. He is well known, very well known for his work on bowerbirds, which is, of course, sort of an iconic group here in the Australasian region. But he's worked on guppies, spiders, insects, birds, other things. I don't know. I've lost track of everything that John's working on, but he's a behavioral ecologist, and he's extremely well known and eminent member of the Royal Society. So, without further ado, let's please welcome Dr. John Endler. Thank you, Professor.
Let's see if I can work this. Yeah. All right. Well, presumably you all know what bowerbirds are, but just in case, here are 6 of the 8 species photographs and 7 of the 8 species in the bowers. So just to refresh your memory what this is about. And this is the function of the bower, just like a teenager in his car with his imagination, the same way that this does. So it's basically something used for mating and nothing else. The females nest at the top of trees in a really clumsy looking nest. It's nothing near like as good as the webbing and the net weaving of this. So I'm going to have 2 parts of this talk. The first gives the background. So they use geometry and cognition for mate choice, but they also use these same things for bower location, which starts to become general for any species. So here's the background. The great bowerbird has the largest bower. It consists of 2 rows of sticks making it almost a tunnel and 2 courts where the courtship takes place. And the avenue is so narrow that it restricts the female's field of view. And outside the field of view, they're often brightly colored objects. And the gradient has some interesting effects too, small at the beginning and larger further back. So let's see if this works. So this is what the display consists of. He picks up things and tosses them across. And it also makes quite a bit of noise. And she can't see very much, just sees something that's restricted. There we go. So almost all color objects are outside the field of view, which means the colors don't show until the female picks them up. So here's outside top view, and here's the female's view. And it's very common for them to be outside the field of view. And there's also an effect of color vision. They paint the inside of the avenue with plant pigment. In this species, the great bowerbird, it makes it red. And the effect of that is, since the female is standing there for quite some time, that she's actually getting chromatically adapted. So you can do this, demonstrate this for yourself. You stare at that dot for 10 seconds and shift over there, which I'll wait for you to do that, and you'll see the effect of chromatic adaptation in inverse colors. That might be long enough. Do you see it? Okay, so here's a bit more detail. The color in the paint is more chromatic than the down at the bottom. So it's a very effective signal. And here's the effect of it. This is a color space where red, green, blue, and ultraviolet, they can see ultraviolet in that circle. But the effect of the chromatic adaptation is to shift the perceived colors in that direction. So it makes the purple and the nuclear crest brighter blue and UV. It makes the green more green. And some of the red will make it more red. Others are going towards the gray point. So it has a very strong effect on chromatic contrast. Now, here's another interesting thing. There's the gradients of size. This is a photograph of the first one where I noticed that. You can see the scale there. So distance from the avenue center, the visible width in terms of how big it is measured from above. But the effect from the side is that the small ones close subtend the same angle as the far ones further away that are larger. And so that gives a nice even pattern. And if we do an experiment where we manipulate them, randomize them, you see the pattern isn't nearly as neat. Now, the nice thing about having this even pattern is that it can induce all sorts of wonderful visual illusions because the visual angle of the objects here are about the same size as the fruits and other things that are displayed. So you can actually get several different illusions which have been known to occur in birds. All right, the last thing, 3 different functions of these illusions. The first one is provides misleading or more stimulating information about size, distance, shape, and color of individuals, parts of individuals, such as the nuclear crest, or objects. So this is a classic thing that gardeners and architects use to change the apparent size of buildings. So these are done at forced perspective for longer than humans ever did. Human forced perspective goes back to the 14th century, but these go back thousands of years. The second one is to attract the viewer's attention long enough for other purposes, such as mating. This is particularly likely when the illusion effects contradict the apparent more reliable cues, such as distance and movement. And then the last one has to do with the chromatic adaptation. The longer the bird stays in the bower, the female stays in the bower, the longer she's exposed to the red, and the stronger the chromatic effect, but also there's an increased probability of mating once she's beyond the minimum time for chromatic adaptation, which is the same for all vertebrates, which is lucky for me. Then the other thing is that the bowers also have a big effect on the sound that the male makes during singing. So these are diagrams of a microphone in the avenue facing outward. And this is the intensity as a function of angle of different ways of measuring in different years. And as you can see, if there's no bower, it's much more diffuse. But if there is a bower, the bird has to sit right in front of the avenue to be heard loudly. And that's just what he does, as you probably noticed in that video. Okay, let's go to probably the more interesting part, at least because it's more new. And that is, what can they do with this baggage of different cognitive abilities to locate the bower in the best possible location? So the first thing is habitat versus microhabitat. Here's habitat. That's the correct habitat. Lots of shrubs in the savanna woodland, but a bad habitat has no shrubs or very few. So they're using some kind of choice to decide to look at these places for a bower location. Then a smaller case, a microhabitat, these two habitats look about the same, but this one is used and this one is not. And this is one of the things I'm trying to figure out at the moment. Why do they choose that one rather than this one? And it's not just a matter of poor leaf cover here. It's actually all sorts of things happen. All right, so the way I'm approaching this is to using a hemispherical camera placed on the bower court facing upwards. And this is a 360-degree solid angle. So it's facing upward on a north court. So that little lamp shows the north point and the bower is to the south in this particular case. But the point is you can see the avenue and the court, what's above the court. And so my surmise is that this might be used as a cue to choosing the location of the bower. Now, the lovely thing about bowerbirds is that their bower site is fixed for the entire breeding season, which is 3 to 5 months. And so it allows us to actually measure qualities above the bower that might be important to the bird, which is related to light intensity. So this is how I do it. I divide up, first of all, I take the color photo and digitize it so that it's either gap or not, which is done here. And then I cover it with all these little sectors. And then I calculate what's called the gap fraction for each sector. And I show that as whiteness for high open and black for dark. And so this gives you an idea of the distribution of gaps in the canopy above bowers, but also above abandoned bowers and above random sites that are also under shrubs, or at least to keep the microhabitat similar. So I'm actually asking, what cues are birds using in this canopy to decide where to place the bower? So here are the 7 species I've looked at over the years, sample sizes there. The great bowerbird has a lot of light, a little bit more north than usual. The random one is pretty random. The spotted bowerbird, which is a close relative, also in woodland like this one, also has a slightly more constant effective light, and it's more random in the controls. Now here are the rainforest species. The fawn-breasted tends to have a couple of little spots, whereas the controls nearby in rainforest are again fairly random. The satin, which most of you have probably heard of because it has a big canopy gap over the bower, the random sites are not nearly as strongly contrasting. The golden isn't quite as different from the background as you can see. It still shows a bit more pattern than the random. The regent, actually, again, the same pattern. Someone's phone is ringing. And the toothbill is even less. No, that's ours. All right, now here's where it starts to become quite interesting. These are the woodland species placed on 2 axes. The standard deviation of the sector gap fraction, which means how variable the light intensity is over the canopy, and the sector diversity, which is how diverse the different intensities are over the surface of the canopy. And so a point here is that the spotted bowerbird, which is congeneric with the greats are dots and the spotted are big circles, they overlap a lot, although the greats have a higher sector diversity. So the 2 that are sympatric, sorry, the 2 that are allopatric overlap excessively. Now the other case is rainforest. It becomes even more interesting there. The same 2 axes, although they don't go quite as far. Here, the first thing you notice is the satin bowerbird hardly overlaps at all with the other species that are found together. The toothbill overlaps with the others, but there's this interesting pattern here in that the regent, fawn-breasted, and golden are allopatric. They're in rainforest, but they're not found together. The toothbill is the only one that overlaps, and the toothbill is quite different. So we basically have something that looks a little bit like character displacement, which is quite interesting. And of course, there are lots of different explanations for that, but at least we actually have evidence for the cues used for bower location involved in character displacement. Sorry, in case you don't know, character displacement is where you've got 2 species which are found together are more different than they're found apart. Okay, now the other way we can look at this is to look at the way the patterns change with distance. This is called an autocorrelation diagram. Some of you might be familiar with that for other purposes. But if what you do is you take the correlation coefficient between, in this case, any 2 particular sectors, and you plot their correlation as a function of distance apart in the canopy. And what you see here, these are 2 woodland species, is that the controls, they drop down and then level. The same thing is true to some extent for the spotted. What that means is a completely random pattern of canopy gaps. But in both cases, the great bowerbird and the spotted are much more regular. You can see that they decline and actually go closer to the 0, and the spotted goes even closer to 0. And these colors are the abandoned ones, which in some cases are intermediate, other cases are not. So again, we have a significant difference between active bowers and bowers from the previous year or the year before. Since I have 27 years of data, I could do that. And then the controls. The rainforest ones are interesting as well, but you can see again, much more regular for the satin. This happens really strongly negative, which means very regular pattern. That's because it has a really big canopy gap directly overhead. The regent has 2 smaller canopy gaps, much smaller in size, but the same pattern, it goes negative. The fawn-breasted, again, some small gaps, and the golden, not quite so fiendish, but still at the larger distances, the correlation goes negative. So there's some degree of regularity in the actual locations they use, but the random patterns are the usual, drops fast, except for the golden, and this becomes relatively flat, which random. So there really are quite different in lots of different ways. And presumably, at least potentially, to be safe, the bowerbirds can be using these cues to decide where to put the bower. Now, there's another point I'm just starting to explore now, and that is, what can they see from the bower? And that's important because it means what can they see for a potential approaching predator or for approaching females, and what can the females see from around it? So we're looking at a bower here and how it can see in various directions. And what I can do is something called view sheds. So what I do is I take a thresholding effect and find all the shrubs in the area. These are aerial photograph or satellite photographs from Queensland Globe. And you can see different patterns of how many directions they can see in lots there, very few here, or how far they can see. And these are different scales. So this is a really small view shed, and this is a much bigger one. So we can calculate this and then ask the question, does the size and shape of the view shed predict anything about what the bowerbirds can do? Presumably they could actually conceive of all these patterns because they're so good at looking at the geometry inside the bower itself. But can they look at this as well? And so here we actually have some plots, since I have some years of mating success from video cameras. And this is gap fraction, which is the total fraction of the sky not blocked by vegetation. And the larger the gap fraction, the greater light intensity. So what you can see is matings per hour, intermediate gap fractions appear to be better. And it's also the same true for displays per hour, but that's not quite as strong. But clearly the gap fraction is important for gaining displays and matings. Although it's not concise, but there's something there. So that means they would hopefully they're learning what the best conditions are. Now these mating things are only from a couple of years, but remember the bowers can be there for 25 years. And so they have plenty of time to learn what the best configuration is and the best location that's going to get the most females. Now here's another one. This is a little bit harder to figure out because it's three-dimensional, but the horizontal axis, this one is the sector standard deviation. That's how variable the gaps are over the 360-degree solid angle of the canopy. And this is the sector diversity. The higher numbers mean they're more equivalently, equally bright patches in a different distribution. And what you can see here is that the ones that get the most matings, this is a typical, actually animal, not just bird pattern of a few individuals get most of the matings, and the rest not. But the pattern is that either high sector diversity and low sector standard deviation, or the opposite, gets the most matings. So this is actually a fairly clear result. Lots of cases where they don't. Of course, it's too bad they don't have more matings, but that's the way it is. But it's definitely an interesting pattern, suggesting that the canopy structure is really important. Now here's the displays. Again, that's a bit more diffuse, but here we have not quite the same pattern. I've got sector diversity in this direction, so you can see that little channel and sector diversity that way. So most of this displays occurs when bowers have canopies with intermediate values of fraction sector diversity and standard deviation. So the two are correlated here, which is not the case for mating. So something interesting is happening there with the cognition. And then the view sheds is also interesting. I actually have a case here where you could have a high standard deviation in view direction, which means almost 360 degrees view, and that either that or mean view distance high, but not both. So there's a negative correlation between the two. Now that might just be an artifact of geometry of being in a woodland, but it's still fairly clear. You can see most bowerbirds that don't get matings do not have those combinations. So something really interesting is happening there as well. So this is the displays per hour. Again, that's more diffuse. But again, we actually have two different patterns here. We have low standard deviation view direction or high, and the opposite for view distance. So the general conclusion here is that we actually have strong evidence that the geometry of the environment where the bower is placed has a strong effect on mating success. And of course, it also has a potentially strong effect on the ability to see if predators are approaching. Now, both Joe Madden, who's worked on spotted bowers, and I have had cameras for years, and we've never seen a predation event on the bower. In fact, the only thing he's ever seen is a raptor presumably hitting the bower in its perch tree above the bower and feathers coming down. But neither of us has ever seen predation on the bower. And in fact, once I was watching a bower up in Cape York for the fawn-breasted bowerbird, and a big goanna came by, and the bowerbird just sat just out of its reach and squawked at it. And it was actually very funny because they were both kind of annoyed at each other. And similar effects in Townsville with cats and bowers. So it's obviously that predation isn't so much of a problem, although it seems extremely puzzling that something can be on the ground for 4 or 5 months and not get eaten. It's really quite remarkable. They seem to be smart enough to stay out of there, but these view sheds may help that because they can tell when something's coming. Okay, so the general conclusion looks like I've gone too fast. 7 Australian bowerbird species have specific and unique canopy geometry patterns. So that means that they're choosing something, and it's definitely choice, because if they abandon it, the geometry changes. So something, I should say, the reason it changes is because the vegetation grows, or a tree fall or limb falls right across it, changes the canopy gaps. The other interesting thing, totally unexpected, is allopatric species have different geometry than sympatric species. Allopatric means not overlapping, sympatric means overlapping. So this suggests character displacement. Now, unfortunately, there aren't enough species, and the distributions of the species aren't big enough to really get a clear answer for character displacement. You need to have transects within the species where you've got some parts of the range where they're allopatric and some parts that are sympatric. And that simply isn't possible in this case, unfortunately. So it just suggests that there's character displacement, but we don't know. There's no way to prove that there is. Okay, the other question is about canopy geometry. It's very different from random locations. So they're very clearly actively choosing microhabitats, even under the same plants. As the Carissa is a shrub genus that they love. Both species love that. And abandoned bowers have different canopy structure than active, and they both have different structure than random. So they're clearly doing some choice. And because they change bower locations every year, they probably are choosing because the canopy changes between years. You know, they do all their mating in the dry season or the end of the dry season. And the wet season means all the plants start growing. And so the canopy structure is going to completely change from when they were successful or when they were not successful. So they have to search every year for a new location. Usually it's about 250 meters away. Okay, so again, the great bowerbird display rates and mating rates are both affected by the canopy geometry. So this is something that could really be done with any species where you have enough information on where they do displays and matings. That's not as easy unless you've got something like a bowerbird where it's fixed. And the display rates and mating rates are both affected by view sheds. Now that's something that might be possible to do with other species. If you took lots and lots of hemispherical photographs and do a view shed calculations over multiple ones, then you might be able to get something at that. And then the fact that the view sheds are important and that you've got intermediate values suggests that predator vigilance is important, because the bower locations are presumably chosen on the basis of trade-offs between mating attraction, mating success, and predation. And so that's going to affect visibility of the bowerbird on the bower, or visibility to its potential mates and to potential predators. So that's an interesting thing that needs more investigation. So in the immediate future, I'll be doing more things with it. So one of the really cool things about hemispherical photographs is that you can use astronomical calculations to actually calculate the track of the sun for any day of the year, given the latitude, longitude, and elevation. The only assumption is no clouds. If there are clouds, then you can't get the big changes. So I can get, and I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to do it soon. I'm going to be able to get the temporal change of light intensity as a function of time for any days. And then hopefully I'll have enough data from matings to see if they're actually choosing particular things. Is the sun in a gap during mating, or is it in the dark part? And in rainforests, the color of the light coming down is quite different. For example, in satins, it's basically white here and it's green here. In woodland, the gaps will be bluish and the shades will be bluish and the gaps will be white again. So again, there's some really interesting interactions between the ambient light color and the color of the bowerbirds and their decorations. So we have these questions to get at. Do particular geometric forms promote mating success? I'm sort of getting at that, but I'll need to do this first. Do changes in canopy structure cause abandonment? I'm pretty sure that's the case because we certainly see abandonment within a breeding season if a tree or a big limb falls across the canopy and it changes. Do birds select canopy structure and sun-select timing at random with specific criteria? Does this correspond to when they display to females and when females arrive? So that's completely unknown at the moment, but this solar track business will help to get that. And can these data be used to predict distribution of bowers given canopy structure? So that's interesting. The question is, why do some places have high densities of bowerbirds, others have low density? And it's not just a matter of the photograph I showed earlier on with the right habitat and the wrong habitat. It looks, often it's the case, it looks the same, widely spaced eucalypts and other trees, and the carissa shrubs underneath them, or China apple underneath them, which they also like. But it's not clear what they use. So it must have to do, well, maybe it has to do with the distribution of the canopy structure. So in addition to this, especially for rainforest species, this data could be used to predict effects of humans damaging vegetation. And in addition, not just direct effects of timber cutting, but also climate change actually is well known to cause canopy thinning, which completely changes the canopy structure, which might make it very unhappy for bowerbirds that use the canopy, especially for dark canopy. Probably wouldn't hurt the satin bowerbird, but it probably would hurt the other rainforest species. So what it suggests is that these methods could be used for any species where one can locate the critical places. So you basically need some repeatability where you're measuring the canopy. And if you can do that for any species, you can do a lot of the same things I've done with this. And then you might be able to say, what factors does an animal need to be able to reproduce and avoid predation in a habitat which otherwise looks perfectly okay? So this would get the critical cues for species in microhabitat choice. So that's basically an almost completely unexplored idea. I'm not the first person to use view sheds. There was a couple of people that worked on busters in Spain that did the first job, not like this, but it was still, that was wonderful just to see that. All right, so I finished a little bit too soon. I go too fast, but this was an initially unintended offshoot of 27 years of studying color patterns of bowers and their decorations. So it shows the value of keeping your data and thinking about it, because I got a whole lot of stuff out of it that I never would have guessed when I started. So thanks to multiple PhD students and postdocs and helpful academics for helping and co-authoring earlier work, and several granting agencies, including James Cook, as well as my own personal funds. And then finally, I'll give very happy to acknowledge the First Nations people, but I initially like to say that I would love to talk to them because they probably know tons about bowerbirds that is unknown, but has been well known for centuries, and I'd love to be able to talk about them. So I'll be happy to have questions now.
Questions? Hey, thank you very much for the talk. My question is about the other perspective.
Sorry, the what?
The other perspective. So we are looking at bowerbird.
I'm a little bit deaf. The other what?
Perspective. So
Sorry, I'm getting that word. Oh, perspective. Sorry.
Yeah. So you're looking at how and why bowerbirds are choosing the locations for the bower based on the structure of the microhabitat.
That's right.
But since it's such a high cost for these animals to work on these bowers with the sole purpose of attracting females, have you thought about looking at the choices of these animals based on what the females' preferences are?
That would be much more difficult. There's not much known about females. In fact, even getting data on their paternity is difficult. So people that have spent their entire lives studying birds, real ornithologists, not me, have a hard time finding the nests. So that would be really difficult. It'd be great to know what females look, but in a sense, I'm getting at that indirectly by those diagrams showing mating success, because that obviously requires the female to be present. But I can't get a direct estimate of what the females prefer other than mating success. It'd be great to do experiments, but if you'd like to suggest, in fact, you'd actually like to do it, that'd be great.
Okay, Sue. Yeah.
Thank you, John. So I have a question about, well, 27 years, at least probably in the last 20 years, we've seen quite a lot of quite dramatic change in climate. And I just wondered how that might be affecting. So you're looking very much top down in terms of the microclimate, or so you're looking more up in terms of the microclimate. But I was thinking just about this, the heat that builds in the soil from the sun, particularly at the end of the dry season,
Well,
just how hot
they are under shrubs, so the temperature isn't significantly warmer than outside. In fact, I had a postdoc who was really a PhD who's actually very interested in the plants, and do the plants differentially germinate under abandoned bowers? And the answer is yes. There's slightly more moisture and they're slightly cooler. So I don't know if that's a problem. I actually haven't seen significant changes over the years. The longest time I've looked at is the great bowerbird. And wet and dry seasons have changed, but the effects are about the same. But I haven't explicitly looked at that, but there's certainly no obvious change. But on the other hand, the effect of increasing dryness in both woodland and rainforest, as you know, is thinning of the canopy. And that could have profound effects. So you could think maybe in the future, certain species of bowerbirds won't have the right canopy conditions and therefore won't be able to reproduce. So we just have to hope that we could look out for maybe even plant trees or put shade things up.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
Thanks. Thanks. It's really interesting. How do you choose your controls? And do you need to have lots and lots and lots of controls to?
You probably didn't see this sample sizes. I have lots of controls for almost every bower I have. I take a random direction and then go to the nearest shrub of the same species with a tree over it. So I'm trying to choose the same gross microhabitat. So it's not really a habitat control, because half of that, well, even more than half of those would be out in the open, which would be nonsense. So they're the best controls I could have. But even more interesting controls, of course, are the abandoned bowers, which the bowerbirds initially chose the previous year before that. And they clearly are different now, but of course things have grown or collapsed since then. Or an emu has walked over it, or a cow has walked over it.
But even with, so you choose one with a bush and a tree over it, even under that bush, you could probably choose 10 different controls, right? But
I don't do it under the same bush. I use another bush that looks similar in a random direction. But yes, you could do it underneath, and it wouldn't be that different. I have tried moving it around.
Okay. But
I'm trying to get the maximum effect of the randomness.
Thank you.
But I could, yeah, interesting question.
Great. Any questions? Oh. And any questions online? Feel free to, just after this next question.
Thank you, John. Is there any evidence that bowerbirds manipulate the geometry of the canopy? I was thinking of the microclimate. I was thinking with the tooth-billed bowerbird, for instance, and its propensity to use leaves. I'm wondering if bowerbirds actually manipulate the canopy.
For a while, we thought that maybe the great bowerbird opens up little canopy holes, but it's not significant. On the other hand, I have worked with the cock of the rock, which is also, some people don't like the idea of calling it a bower, but it goes to the ground and clears it, and it clears leaves around it. It also clears leaves where it's displaying. So that's a really good example where the bird is actually modifying the light environment. It also modifies the light environment in another way. It eats a certain set of a certain subset of tree species, and that subset is defecated on the lect site. And those species actually have thinner than usual leaves and white bark. So the effect is very bright green light, which enhances the color of their plumage. So there's a really interesting manipulation there. Unfortunately, I haven't seen that in the bowerbirds, at least not significantly. It certainly has a great potential for it. But it's, yeah, it would be interesting to know whether they actually tried to make holes evenly spaced to get a more dappled thing. But the trouble is the sun position changes, as you can see in this diagram. And that would change over the day and over the season. And so it would maybe be hard for the bird to choose where it should make a hole.
Oh, yep. Questions online, I guess.
Hi, John. Great talk. I have a question that's kind of in my head and I haven't formulated it into a sentence yet, so we'll see how I go. But so if the effects of climate change are potentially going to affect the canopy cover and therefore whether there's the right light structure for mating success,
That's right,
are the females that picky that if none of the males satisfy their requirements, they just won't mate? Or will they, you know, bend their
That's a very good
requirements a
question.
bit?
It's quite possible, but we probably don't have enough data to do that yet. They are picky, given the effect that I showed in those three-dimensional graphs with the mating success and the display rates. They're clearly dependent on the canopy, but whether it's specific enough. In other words, those diagrams didn't show a central peak and zero elsewhere. That would suggest really high specialization. They're more diffuse, especially for the display rates. So maybe we're safe for now, but if it gets worse and worse, if rainforest becomes woodland, then they've had it. Hopefully not, but that is a perfectly good question to ask.
Thanks.
Okay, Sue?
It's so loud, the display rates. Oh, when do they display during the day? Is it
They display actually from morning to evening. There are peaks at different times of day for different bowers, and that goes with my sun track business. But yes, it's during the day, and sometimes it's correlated with the sun patch on the bower, which of course would increase the color contrast, but not always. On the other hand, we don't have enough data to say, are the successful males taking advantage of sun patches? I don't know the answer to that. That would be really great. Some student needs to work on that. Hint, hint.
Okay, no questions online? I just have one last question, John. So you were talking about the fact that you haven't really observed any predation events or any obvious predation events.
It's not at the bower.
At the bowers, right? But just 27 years is quite a large data set.
Yeah.
Is your thinking that you're sort of invoking a ghost of predation past in terms of describing the behavior of the males on these sites? You think that they're behaving in a certain way because their behavior has been shaped by past selection?
It may be, but that's a little bit too speculative for my taste, because you can't really say that. They could just be shaping their behavior on the basis of what gets the female's attention.
All right, yeah.
And just look out for predators, which something goes back to the Pleistocene earlier.
Right.
So I can't say with any assurance whether that's the case or not. It's not obvious, because again, when I first started working at Bowerbirds, I said, how can they possibly do that? Spend multiple months on the ground and not get eaten? And they don't. As I said, especially Townsville, there are lots of bowers and lots of cats. You just see, I'm in the bower here, and the cat's about where you are, and they're looking at each other and just saying, too bad. It's actually quite amusing.
Yeah.
But they obviously know what they're doing. Of course, they're one of the most intelligent birds as well, which probably helps. That the goanna was so funny because it was clearly the bird knew just how high to sit and squawk. Actually, it sounded like it was swearing because they're the best mimics I've ever heard.
Oh, yeah.
And it just did that. And the goanna looked at it.
Yeah.
It just got fed up and left.
Phylogenetically, what are bowerbirds closest to? What's their sister group?
The lyrebirds.
Which one?
Lyrebirds.
Lyrebirds.
There are a couple others that I never can remember. They're
Okay.
small tree creeper-like things.
Okay. So they're off on a kind of a branch on their own. Is it? Yeah.
Sorry?
Very ancient, the libraries, aren't they?
Yeah, supposedly fairly, yeah. Yeah.
Right.
There's controversy now about where the catbirds fit relative to the bowerbirds proper and the two clades of bowerbirds. And the trouble is, it's all this argument on the basis of some fairly low confidence splitting points back at the time of the tooth bill. So it's hard to say whether the toothbill was ancestor? Probably not. Something that is consistent now is it's sister with the maypole builders. And then the avenue builders split off slightly before. But the confidence limit, which no one seems to mention except you look at it on the diagram, is not that high for those splitting events. So it might just be a trichotomy, in which case we can't say that for sure what came first, which is frustrating for us.
Evolutionary biology. Okay, well, thank you, John, very much. And thanks everybody for coming today, and really very much appreciated. Thank you.